The gavel hadn't even finished echoing when Daniel Harper smiled. It wasn't a loud smile. Daniel was too controlled for that. It was a kind of slow, private smile a man wears when he knows the game is already over, when he knows the other person hasn't realized yet that they're standing on the wrong side of history. He leaned back in his chair, the polished leather creaking softly beneath his weight, and adjusted the cuff of his navy blue suit. Custom tailored. Italian wool. The kind of suit that didn't need a logo because the cut itself announced money, power, permanence. Across the courtroom, seated at the plaintiff's table, his wife, soon to be his ex-wife, Emily Harper, kept her eyes down. Daniel noticed that immediately. He noticed everything. Emily's hands were folded too tightly in her lap. Her shoulders were slightly hunched, as if she were trying to take up less space in the room. She wore a simple cream-colored dress, unbranded, modest, the opposite of the designer pieces Daniel had once insisted she wear to company events. Her dark hair was pulled back, neat but unstyled, the way it had been before he'd turned her into an accessory. She looked smaller than he remembered. Good, Daniel thought. This was how it was supposed to look. To Daniel Harper, Courtroom 7B of the Los Angeles County Superior Court didn't smell like floor polish and old paper. It smelled like victory, like champagne waiting to be uncorked, like the first clean breath after you finally cut dead weight loose. Beside him, his attorney, Richard Cole, stacked documents with calm precision. Richard was a man who had built an entire career on dismantling people quietly. No theatrics, no raised voices, just facts arranged like a noose. Daniel paid him $1,200 an hour, and every dollar felt like an investment paying compound interest. Relax, Richard murmured without looking up. We're exactly where we planned to be. Daniel chuckled under his breath. I know. I'm just enjoying the moment. He tilted his head slightly, letting his gaze drift back to Emily. 5 years. 5 years of dinners he funded. Vacations he paid for, friends he tolerated because she liked them, 5 years of her quiet suggestions, her little concerns, her annoying questions about finances and offshore structures she didn't understand. And now she thought she could leave. She thought she could threaten him with moral lectures, with talk of transparency, with the audacity to say things like, I don't recognize you anymore. Daniel's smile widened just a fraction. This was the part people like Emily never understood. Love didn't protect you. Money did. Preparation did. Planning 6 steps ahead did. And Daniel Harper planned everything. Judge William Klein cleared his throat from the bench. He was a heavy-set man in his late 50s with tired eyes and the permanent irritation of someone who had seen too many people waste the court's time with emotional messes dressed up as legal disputes. Mr. Harper, the judge said, glancing at his notes, your counsel has submitted a motion to enforce the prenuptial agreement in full and deny spousal support based on evidence of marital misconduct. Is that correct? Yes, Your Honor, Richard said smoothly, rising to his feet. The agreement is explicit, and the evidence submitted clearly demonstrates infidelity on Mrs. Harper's part. Daniel didn't look at Emily when Richard said it. He didn't need to. He already knew how this played out. The evidence was airtight, or airtight enough. A set of photos, hotel timestamps, metadata, digital breadcrumbs carefully planted by a private investigator who knew exactly what kind of narrative Daniel needed. Emily hadn't cheated. That part didn't matter. What mattered was that Daniel could prove she had. Emily's lawyer, a court-appointed attorney named Laura Bennett, stood abruptly. She looked exhausted. The kind of exhausted that came from months of fighting a battle she knew she couldn't win. Your Honor, Laura said, her voice tight, my client denies these allegations. The photographs are inconclusive and... Counsel, Judge Klein interrupted, already rubbing his temple. The metadata has been verified. Unless you have something concrete to challenge the digital forensics, I'm inclined to accept the evidence. Emily didn't look up. Daniel felt a familiar surge of satisfaction bloom in his chest. She's not even fighting back. He leaned toward Richard and whispered, "She always did freeze when things got hard." Richard didn't respond. He didn't need to. This wasn't about commentary. It was about execution. Judge Klein flipped through the file, then looked up again. In light of the evidence and the terms of the prenuptial agreement, the court is prepared to rule. Daniel's fingers tapped once against the table. A small, controlled movement. Not impatience. Anticipation. The marital assets, the judge continued, including Harper Dynamics, the primary residence in Beverly Hills, and all associated liquid accounts, will remain the sole property of Mr. Daniel Harper. Mrs. Harper will receive the agreed-upon severance payment of $25,000 and vacate the premises within 72 hours. $25,000. Daniel almost laughed. That wouldn't cover a month of expenses in the world he lived in. It was a symbolic amount. A reminder of where she belonged now. He finally looked at Emily then, hoping, just a little, to see tears. Shock. The realization settling in that she had gambled and lost. Her face was pale, but calm. Too calm. That annoyed him. Is there anything further before the court issues a final decree? Judge Klein asked, glancing at the clock. It was nearly noon. Lunchtime. Richard stood. "No, Your Honor." Daniel straightened in his seat. This was it. The gavel lifted. The doors at the back of the courtroom opened, not gently. They didn't creak. They didn't ease open like someone unsure of their welcome. They swung inward with a weight that seemed to shift the air in the room. A low murmur rippled through the benches as heads turned in unison. Daniel frowned. Courtrooms weren't supposed to have surprises at this stage. A man stood in the doorway. He was older, late 60s maybe, but age had done nothing to soften him. He wore a charcoal suit, so precisely cut it looked sculpted rather than sewn. No shine, no flash, just authority pressed into fabric. In one hand, he held a cane, not as support, but as punctuation. Polished black wood, silver handle shaped into something indistinct from this distance. Behind him stood two other men, both in dark suits, both carrying slim briefcases. They moved with the quiet coordination of people who had spent their lives entering rooms that didn't belong to them and leaving with control. Daniel felt an unfamiliar flicker of irritation. Who lets people just walk in like this? Court is in session. The bailiff snapped, stepping forward. "You'll need to—" Judge Klein raised a hand. Slowly. His expression had changed. The impatience was gone, replaced by something Daniel couldn't quite read. Recognition, maybe, or calculation. The older man began walking down the aisle. Tap, tap, tap. Each step was unhurried, deliberate. He didn't look at Daniel, didn't look at the judge. His attention was fixed on one place only. Emily. Emily finally lifted her head. The shift was immediate. Her shoulders straightened. Her breath caught, not in relief, but in something closer to resignation. She stood. "Dad," she said quietly. Daniel's stomach tightened. "Dad?" The man stopped in front of her and looked down. His eyes softened just enough to register concern. "Nothing more." "You didn't call," he said. "I wanted to handle it myself," Emily replied. Her voice wavered, but she didn't look away. The man glanced around the courtroom, took in Daniel, Richard, the judge, the scattered arrogance hanging in the air like perfume. "And how is that working out for you?" he asked calmly. Daniel pushed his chair back and stood. "Your Honor," he said sharply, "this is highly inappropriate. This is a closed proceeding." Richard reached out and grabbed his sleeve. Hard. "Sit down," Richard hissed. his voice suddenly unsteady. Daniel turned on him. "What are you doing?" The older man finally looked at Daniel. The effect was physical. Daniel felt it in his throat first, a sudden dryness, then in his chest, as if the air had thickened. There was no anger in the man's eyes, no hostility, just assessment, the kind you give a structural flaw before you decide where to apply pressure. "Mr. Harper," the judge said carefully, his voice no longer booming, "I wasn't aware Mrs. Harper's father would be present today. She didn't use my last name," the man said. "That was her first mistake." He turned back to Emily, placing a hand lightly on her shoulder. "I'm here now," he said. Daniel opened his mouth to speak again, to reassert control, to remind the room who he was, and realized with a sudden unwelcome clarity that something had shifted. The celebration he'd been savoring only minutes ago now felt premature, like clinking glasses before the doors were locked. And for the first time since this divorce began, Daniel Harper felt a thin line of uncertainty slip under his skin. Daniel sat down because Richard didn't give him a choice. The grip on his sleeve stayed there, quiet, steady, like a seatbelt locking after an impact. And Daniel hated it, not because it hurt, because it meant Richard had just assessed the room and decided Daniel was no longer safe to speak. Emily's father didn't look at Daniel again. He turned slightly, as if Daniel had already been filed away mentally under "handled later," and that was worse than hostility. Daniel could fight anger. He could even fight ridicule. But indifference from a man who walked into a courtroom like he owned the air, that was a different kind of danger. Judge Klein cleared his throat. The sound didn't carry the same authority it did 10 minutes ago. His eyes kept flicking down to a paper he hadn't had earlier, like he was rereading something he didn't want to be true. "Mr. Bennett," the judge said finally, voice careful, "you're not counsel of record." "I can be," the older man replied calmly. The way he said it made it less like a request and more like a correction. Daniel leaned in toward Richard, keeping his voice low. "Who is he?" Richard didn't answer immediately. His jaw was clenched, and the skin beside his temple twitched in a way Daniel had never seen. Richard Cole never showed strain. Richard Cole didn't flinch. So why was he flinching now? Emily's father nodded to the two men behind him. They moved forward and placed briefcases on the table, with quiet precision. No rushing, no nervousness, like this was routine. One of them slid a document toward the clerk. The other handed Laura Bennett, Emily's exhausted attorney, a folded piece of paper. Laura glanced at it, and her eyes widened so fast it looked like pain. Then she blinked hard, stood, and began packing her bag. Daniel's irritation spiked. What is she doing? Richard still didn't answer. He watched Laura like a man watching an evacuation. Judge Klein looked up again, his expression shifting from fatigue to caution. "Mrs. Harper, are you dismissing your counsel?" Emily's voice was quiet but steady. "Yes, Your Honor." She didn't look at Daniel when she said it. Daniel felt a flash of anger. That calm, that contained stillness. It was new. It was not the Emily he'd trained into shrinking. Judge Klein exhaled through his nose. "And who is representing you now?" Emily swallowed. Her eyes flicked to the older man for half a second, then forward. "My father..." Daniel's laugh came out sharp, forced. "This is ridiculous. You can't just..." "Mr. Harper..." Judge Klein snapped, and Daniel froze at the tone. "You will not speak unless I ask you a question." Richard's hand tightened on Daniel's forearm under the table, warning him again. The older man stepped closer to the bench, posture straight, expression unreadable. "Your Honor, I'm entering my appearance and requesting a short recess before the decree is issued." Judge Klein's eyes narrowed. "On what grounds?" "Falsified evidence," the man said. The room changed, not with gasps, with silence. The kind of silence that makes people lean forward without realizing they're moving. Daniel's skin went cold and thin strip down his spine. He forced a smile. Our evidence has been verified. The older man turned his head toward Daniel slowly, as if deciding whether Daniel deserved a response. Then he spoke, voice calm enough to sound almost polite. Mr. Harper, men like you love a room when you think the ending is yours. So I'm going to do you a kindness. Daniel's throat tightened. A kindness? I'm going to stop you from humiliating yourself further by talking, the man said, and then turned back to the judge as if Daniel had already been handled. Judge Klein held still. Mr. Bennett, this is a serious allegation. It is, Bennett agreed, which is why I'm prepared to prove it quickly. Richard stood. Your Honor, this is highly irregular. The court is already. Judge Klein raised a hand without looking at him. Sit down, Mr. Cole. Richard sat. Daniel's eyes flicked to Richard, shocked. Richard didn't even fight it. He obeyed like his body had decided the argument wasn't worth the exposure. Bennett gestured, and one of his men handed a thin folder to the bailiff. The bailiff didn't toss it on the bench like normal files. He carried it carefully, as if the paper was heavier than paper should be. Judge Klein opened it and began reading. Bennett didn't rush. He let the judge read first. Let the room watch the judge's face change. That was the first humiliation beat, and Daniel recognized it too late. The judge's eyes tightened, his mouth pressed into a line. Daniel's confidence tried to hold, but he felt a small crack appear in it, like ice underfoot. Judge Klein looked up. Mr. Cole, he said slowly, did you personally verify the chain of custody for the digital evidence? Richard's voice was smooth, but it had a fraction of instability in it now. Your Honor, we relied on a licensed investigator and certified forensic review. Bennett nodded once. And that, he said quietly, is how arrogant men outsource their lies. Daniel's face flushed. Objection. Judge Klein's eyes snapped at Daniel. You will remain silent. Daniel swallowed the words back, jaw tight. Bennett continued, still calm. Your Honor, the metadata verification was conducted by a contractor who has worked with Mr. Harper's company before. Judge Klein's eyebrows lifted slightly. Explain. Bennett's tone stayed level, but every word landed like a nail. There is a conflict of interest. There is also a payment trail. It's in the folder. Daniel's heart thudded once hard. Payment trail? He leaned toward Richard, barely moving his lips. What folder? Richard didn't look at him. His eyes were fixed forward, and the silence his response was the first time Daniel felt something close to fear from him. Judge Klein flipped another page, then another. He stopped and stared at one section longer than the rest. Then he looked up again, and his voice was colder. Mr. Harper. Daniel stood instantly like a reflex. Yes, Your Honor. Did you commission, directly or indirectly, any evidence intended to mislead this court? Daniel forced a laugh. Absolutely not. Bennett didn't react. He didn't smile. He didn't argue emotionally. He simply nodded to his man again. A single page was handed forward. Judge Klein read it. His face hardened. Daniel's mouth went dry. He couldn't see the paper from where he stood, but he could feel it anyway. The way the room began to look at him differently, as if people were reassessing the story they thought they were watching. Bennett spoke softly. Your Honor, I'm requesting the court strike the evidence and pause the decree. I'm also requesting the court consider sanctions if this was deliberate. Daniel's pride surged. Try and protect him. This is a stunt. She's trying to... Judge Klein raised his hand. Enough. The judge's voice lowered. I'm granting a recess. Daniel blinked. A recess? You were about to... 1 hour. Judge Klein said, and the gavel came down once. Not loud. Final. The bailiff called it. People stood, the courtroom filled with murmurs, and Daniel realized, with a sick tightening in his chest, that the murmurs were no longer about Emily. They were about him. Richard yanked his phone out immediately and started texting fast. Daniel watched his lawyer's fingers move like they were trying to put out a fire before it reached oxygen. Daniel grabbed Richard's arm. Tell me what's happening. Richard's eyes finally met his, and Daniel didn't like what he saw there. It wasn't panic. It was calculation mixed with regret. That's Thomas Bennett, Richard said quietly. Daniel frowned. So? Richard swallowed. He doesn't lose. Daniel scoffed weakly. He's old. He's the kind of man judges remember, Richard cut in, voice tight. And the kind of man your enemies call when they want you erased legally. Daniel's pulse hammered. Why haven't I heard of him? Richard let out a breath that sounded like disbelief. Because you don't read about the men who end stories. You only read about the men who start them. Daniel's jaw clenched. Across the aisle, Bennett was speaking to Emily in a low voice. Emily wasn't crying. She wasn't triumphant. She looked like someone holding shame in one hand and relief in the other, unsure which one she deserved. That bothered Daniel more than tears would have. Daniel's phone buzzed. A text from Madison. Are we still flying tonight? Daniel stared at the message, then looked back into the courtroom through the glass window on the door. Bennett wasn't rushing. He wasn't reacting. He wasn't even negotiating yet. He was preparing. Daniel typed back, still on. He didn't know why he lied. Maybe because he needed to believe that somewhere in some part of the day, he was still in control. He slid the phone into his pocket. And for the first time since he filed for divorce, Daniel Harper felt something new settle under his confidence. Not fear. Not yet. Something worse. The sense that the punishment hadn't started, but the countdown had. The hour recess didn't feel like an hour. It felt like a slow tightening, like the courtroom had turned into a room where oxygen was being measured and rationed, and Daniel Harper was the only one pretending not to notice. Outside, the hallway was full of the same polished shoes and controlled voices it always had. Lawyers gliding past each other with neutral faces. Clerks carrying files like they were carrying someone else's future. A security guard sipping coffee by the elevators. Normal. But Daniel could feel the difference in how people looked at him now. Not openly. Not long. Just quick glances that slid away too fast. Like he was no longer simply another rich man getting divorced, but a story with an ending people wanted to witness. Richard paced with his phone in his hand, making calls that kept going to voicemail. Daniel watched him for a moment and realized something that made his stomach tighten. Richard wasn't acting like a man waiting for a recess to end. He was acting like a man trying to get ahead of damage. Daniel stepped closer. Who are you calling? Richard didn't answer at first. He stared at the screen like he could force it to ring through sheer will. Then he lowered the phone and looked at Daniel, and his voice came out quieter than Daniel had ever heard it. I'm checking whether your investigator is about to disappear. Daniel's jaw clenched. He won't. He's on my payroll. Richard's mouth tightened. That's not comforting. Daniel's pride surged again, trying to cover the thin nervousness in his chest. This is a delay tactic. Bennett walks in, waves papers, tries to scare the judge. We hold our ground, we win, we leave. Richard stared at him like Daniel had just said the sky was made of glass. You still think this is about winning, he said. Bennett isn't trying to scare anyone. He's trying to put a permanent mark on the record. Daniel leaned closer, voice low. I don't care about the record. I care about the decree. Richard's eyes didn't blink. The record is what makes decrees reversible. Daniel froze, irritation flaring. Are you saying he can undo what was about to happen? Richard exhaled slowly. I'm saying you should stop acting like the gavel was a finish line. Daniel's phone buzzed again. Madison, this is embarrassing. People are staring. Just tell me if I should leave. Daniel stared at the message, heat rising in his face. Madison's world was immediate. Flights, photos, attention. She didn't understand courtrooms. She didn't understand reputations built over decades and destroyed in minutes. He typed back, "Stay. I'll handle it." He didn't even believe himself when he sent it. When the bailiff called everyone back into Courtroom 7B, the shift was unmistakable. It wasn't louder. It wasn't dramatic. It was smaller than that, more dangerous. People sat straighter. The murmurs died quicker. The court reporter's hands hovered ready over the keys, as if she expected lines that would be quoted later. Judge Klein returned with a face that looked different than before recess. More awake, more careful. The kind of careful that came after a phone call that made someone sit up and listen. "We're back on the record," Judge Klein said, gavel tapping once. Daniel sat perfectly still, hands flat on the table, forcing calm into his posture. His suit fit like armor, but for the first time it felt like armor someone else might begin peeling off piece by piece. Thomas Bennett stood when the judge looked at him. "Mr. Bennett," Judge Klein said, "you've alleged falsified evidence." "Yes, Your Honor," Bennett replied. Daniel felt his body tense, not from fear, but from the humiliation of being forced to sit quietly while another man dictated the tone of his own divorce. Bennett's voice stayed level. "The defense claims the photographs and metadata prove my daughter was at the Crescent Bay Hotel on October 17th at 9:18 p.m. He paused long enough to let everyone picture it. Then he continued, "The problem is she wasn't." One of Bennett's men handed a thin file to the bailiff, who carried it forward again with that careful, almost respectful motion. Judge Klein opened it. Bennett didn't rush. He let the judge read first. Let the judge's face do the work. Daniel watched Judge Klein's eyes move line by line, then stop. The judge's lips pressed together. A muscle jumped at his jaw. Daniel felt the air get thinner. Bennett spoke softly. "Exhibit A is a credit card purchase at a gas station in Malibu at 9:22 p.m. The signature matches Emily's card. Exhibit B is security footage confirming her presence. The attendant provided a sworn statement." Daniel's stomach clenched. He turned his head slightly toward Emily, expecting her to look triumphant. She didn't. She looked sick, like the truth had weight, and she was the one carrying it. Judge Klein looked up sharply at Richard. "Mr. Cole," he said, voice cold, "did you verify chain of custody on your digital evidence?" Richard's throat bobbed. "Your Honor, we relied on—" "Answer the question," Judge Klein snapped. Richard's mouth tightened. "No, Your Honor, we did not personally verify chain of custody." Daniel felt something crack. Not loud, not cinematic, just a tiny internal fracture in the certainty he had been living inside. Bennett nodded once, as if this was expected. "And the metadata verification," Bennett added, "was conducted by a contractor with prior business ties to Mr. Harper's company." Judge Klein's eyes narrowed. He flipped a page and his expression hardened further. "There's a payment trail," he murmured, more to himself in the room. Daniel's heart thudded. Hard. Bennett didn't gloat. He didn't even raise his voice. "Yes, Your Honor. A transfer from Mr. Harper's personal account to the investigator labeled consulting, followed by a cash withdrawal." Daniel stood abruptly, unable to stop himself. I didn't." Judge Klein's head snapped up. "Mr. Harper," he said, voice sharp enough to slice, "you will sit down." Daniel's face burned. He sat, slowly. His hand shook once as he adjusted his tie, and he hated that more than anything. He hated the body telling the truth before his mouth could reshape it. Judge Klein looked at Bennett. The evidence of infidelity is stricken. The words landed heavy. Bennett nodded, not satisfied, but focused. Thank you, Your Honor. Now, because the prenuptial agreement contains a morality clause. Richard stood quickly. Objection. Judge Klein held up a hand without looking at him. Sit down. Richard sat, and Daniel realized with a bitter taste in his mouth that Richard was no longer driving the room either. Bennett continued, voice quiet. The clause was designed to punish marital misconduct. Mr. Harper attempted to use it against Emily with fabricated proof. He paused. So the court should now examine Mr. Harper's conduct. Daniel's jaw tightened. His mind scrambled for an exit, for some alternate angle, for any way to twist the story back into a win. Judge Klein looked at Daniel. Mr. Harper, he said, do you object? Daniel forced calm into his voice. Yes, this is irrelevant. Bennett's eyes flicked toward Daniel with mild curiosity, like he was watching an animal try to argue with a trap. It's not irrelevant, Bennett said softly. It's symmetrical. He reached into his folder and withdrew a single sheet. No stack. No theatrics. One page, clean and confident. For the past 2 years, Bennett said, Mr. Harper has maintained an extramarital relationship with Madison Hale. Daniel felt his throat close. He didn't look at Emily. He couldn't. He could feel her presence like a spotlight he refused to step into. Bennett kept his tone clinical. Ms. Hale is employed at Harper Dynamics. A lease payment on a Mercedes signed by Mr. Harper. An apartment in West Hollywood paid through a shell entity connected to Mr. Harper. Tuition payments funded from the joint marital account. The room was silent again, but it was a different silence. This wasn't curiosity silence. This was condemnation silence. Judge Klein's voice sharpened. Mr. Harper, he said, did you use joint funds to support an extramarital relationship? Daniel swallowed. I earned. Answer the question, Judge Klein said. Daniel's tongue felt thick. Yes. Emily made a sound then. Not a sob. Not a scream. A small inhale that sounded like the exact moment a person realizes they were loyal to someone who never deserved it. Bennett didn't turn to comfort her. He didn't need to. He was doing something more dangerous than comfort. He was restoring her dignity by destroying the lie that she had been weak. She didn't deserve to be punished for your misconduct, Bennett said quietly. Daniel snapped, desperation wearing anger like a mask. So what? Every rich man has a girlfriend. That doesn't void. Judge Klein's eyes turned hard. Mr. Harper, he said, this court does not operate on your social norms. Bennett nodded once, as if the judge had simply confirmed math. The morality clause, Bennett said, and the dissipation clause regarding marital funds void the asset protection provisions Mr. Harper is attempting to enforce. Judge Klein flipped through the prenup again, then stopped on a paragraph and stared at it longer than he should have. Daniel felt the room, holding its breath. Then Judge Klein looked up. The prenuptial agreement, the judge said slowly, is invalid. Daniel went still. No, he said, voice low and raw. No, it can't be. Bennett didn't move. It is. Daniel's hands gripped the edge of the table. His mind raced, fast, greedy, searching. Fine. He could lose the house. He could lose money. Money could be rebuilt. Losses could be spun. He could walk out of this bruised but intact. He leaned forward, forcing his voice steady. Okay, Daniel said. Okay, split the assets. Take the house. Take the accounts. Whatever. But Harper Dynamics is protected. Richard's head turned sharply toward him like Daniel had just stepped on a landmine. Daniel ignored him. He was clinging to the one pillar he believed couldn't fall. The company is in a trust. Daniel insisted. My trust. You can't touch it. That's mine. For the first time, Bennett's expression shifted. Not anger. Not triumph. Something close to pity. Oh, Daniel, Bennett said softly, using his first name like it was an old habit. You still think you built your empire alone. Daniel's stomach tightened. What does that mean? Bennett's eyes stayed on him. It means you spent years mistaking secrecy for ownership. Daniel's breath hitched. Stop talking in riddles. Bennett turned to Judge Klein. Your Honor, I'm requesting the court accept a supplemental filing pertaining to Harper Dynamics' founding capital. Daniel's blood went cold. Judge Klein hesitated just a fraction, then nodded. Proceed. Bennett reached into his folder again, but this time he didn't pull out a thick binder. He pulled out a single document. Thin, old, and somehow, even from where Daniel sat, it looked like the kind of paper you never want to see again once you've signed it. Bennett held it out, not for the room, but for the record. This, Bennett said quietly, is the instrument that funded Harper Dynamics before it ever became yours. Daniel's voice cracked. That's not real. Bennett's eyes met his. You signed it. Daniel's chest tightened as memory tried to climb out of sealed place. 24 years old. Desperate. A stack of paperwork. A promise of funding. A silent investor. Daniel's hands began to tremble despite his effort to stop them. Who? Daniel whispered. Who funded it? Bennett's gaze slid, just once, toward Emily. Emily's eyes widened, her face draining of color. Dad, she breathed, like she already knew she was standing next to a truth she hadn't earned the right to ask for. Bennett didn't answer yet. He simply looked back at Daniel with the calm of a man holding the final card and deciding when the room deserved to see it. And Daniel Harper realized, with a sick tightening in his gut, that the thing he'd been celebrating all morning might have never belonged to him at all. Daniel stared at the document like it might blink first. It didn't. The paper lay there between them, thin, unimpressive, ordinary in the way the most dangerous things always are. No gold seal, no dramatic letterhead, just text, signatures, dates, history reduced to ink. He laughed once, sharp and brittle. That's not what you think it is. Thomas Bennett didn't respond immediately. He let the silence stretch, let Daniel's voice echo back at him, without resistance. The room watched the pause more than the paper. Judge Klein leaned forward slightly. Mr. Bennett, he said, careful again, what exactly is this document? Bennett didn't rush. He placed both hands on the table, palms flat, grounding himself in the space like a man who expected to be here for a while. It's a convertible note, he said, executed 11 years ago. It provided the initial capital for Harper Dynamics. Daniel shook his head slowly, like disbelief could undo ink. No, that money came from an angel investor. Anonymous, that's what I was told. Bennett nodded once. You were... Daniel's mouth went dry. So you're saying... I'm saying... Bennett interrupted gently, that anonymity doesn't erase ownership. Emily's breath caught. Daniel felt it then. The subtle, humiliating truth creeping up from memory. The meeting in a small office downtown. The urgency. The pressure. The way he'd been told sign here, and here, because time mattered more than details. He'd been grateful. He'd been arrogant. He'd been young. You don't even know what that document says, Daniel snapped, trying to claw background. You can't just walk in here and reinterpret. I don't need to reinterpret it, Bennett replied. I drafted it. The room froze. Judge Klein's eyebrows lifted a fraction. You drafted the note? Yes, Bennett said, at the request of my daughter. Emily turned fully toward him now, eyes wide. Dad, you never told me. You asked me to help him, Bennett said quietly. without accusation. You didn't ask me to explain how. Daniel's mind reeled. Emily had gone to her father. Emily, the woman he dismissed as passive, naive, ornamental, had been the bridge that made his empire possible. You let me believe it was my idea, Daniel said, voice cracking with anger now. You let me believe I earned it. Bennett's gaze held steady. You earned the work, he said. You didn't earn the leverage. Judge Klein cleared his throat. Mr. Bennett, he said, please explain the relevance of this note to the current proceedings. Bennett nodded. Of course. The note contains a conversion clause triggered by a material breach of marriage. Specifically, a divorce filing initiated under false pretenses. Daniel's head snapped up. That's not. Bennett raised one finger, not to silence Daniel, to mark a point. You filed for divorce, Bennett said, after manufacturing evidence to destroy my daughter's credibility. That constitutes a breach under the agreement. Judge Klein scanned the document again, slower now. And conversion grants. Bennett didn't look away from Daniel as he answered. Majority ownership. The word landed heavier this time because it had context now, because the room understood what it meant. Daniel's pulse hammered. This is insane. You're telling me my wife owns my company because of a piece of paper I signed when I was broke. Bennett's voice stayed level. I'm telling you that your company existed because you weren't. Emily whispered, almost to herself, I never want to control. Bennett finally looked at her fully. His voice softened. Control wasn't the goal. Protection was. Daniel's laugh broke out, loud and hollow. Protection from what? Me. Bennett turned back to him. From men who believe gratitude is optional. Judge Klein leaned back in his chair, hands steepled, eyes sharp. Mr. Harper, he said, do you dispute the authenticity of the document? Daniel opened his mouth, closed it. His legal mind, trained by years of contracts and negotiations, was already racing ahead of his pride. The signature was his. The date aligned. The structure was airtight. No, Daniel said finally. But I dispute the interpretation. Bennett inclined his head. You're welcome to. Judge Klein nodded slowly. That interpretation will be addressed. For now, Daniel surged to his feet, desperation finally tearing through composure. You can't take everything from me. That company is my life, my employees, my reputation. Bennett's voice cut through him, calm but firm. Your employees will be paid. Your reputation will be examined. And your life, he paused, will continue. Daniel stared at him, chest heaving. You planned this. Bennett didn't deny it. I prepared for it. There was a difference. Emily stood then. The room noticed immediately, not because she demanded attention, but because she didn't ask for permission. I didn't want this to be war, she said, voice steady but raw. I wanted to leave with my dignity. Daniel turned toward her, something like panic flashing through his anger. Emily, you don't understand what you're doing. She looked at him, really looked at him, for the first time in years. I understand exactly what I'm doing, she said. I'm letting the truth stand on its own. Bennett placed a hand on her shoulder again, grounding her without owning her moment. Judge Klein cleared his throat. Given the new evidence, this court is ordering a temporary injunction. Daniel felt his stomach drop. Effective immediately, the judge continued. Mr. Harper is suspended from his role as CEO, pending a full financial and ethical audit. The words came calmly, procedurally, like reading weather conditions. Daniel shook his head. You can't. I can't, Judge Klein said flatly. And I am, Bennett added, almost conversationally, I filed a motion this morning. Daniel's knees felt weak. An audit. His mind flashed to spreadsheets he hadn't opened in years. Accounts moved too fast to explain cleanly. Decisions justified in boardrooms, but ugly in daylight. Richard leaned toward him, voice low and urgent. "You need to stop talking." Daniel stared ahead, chest tight. "They're trying to erase me." Richard didn't answer, because part of him knew it was already happening. Judge Klein looked at Daniel with something that resembled disappointment. "Mr. Harper," he said, "this court takes a dim view of litigants who attempt to weaponize the legal system." Daniel swallowed hard. "So what now?" Judge Klein glanced at Bennett, then back to Daniel. "Now, Mr. Harper, we determine how much of what you built survives scrutiny." Bennett met Daniel's eyes one last time, not with triumph, but with something colder. "The punishment," he said quietly, "isn't losing what you took." Daniel felt the words press into him. "It's being seen while it's taken back." The gavel came down, not to end the case, to change who owned the room. And Daniel Harper finally understood what that celebration had been that morning. Not a victory, a farewell he'd been too arrogant to recognize. If you enjoy the story and are interested in the next part of this story, let us know in the comments, and we will make it available on the channel. But make sure you are subscribed to the channel so you can get notified